Merry met, virtual traveller, and welcome to Stories from Lore, a podcast that invites you to rewild yourself through story by exploring nature, folklore, and the stories it inspires. My name is Dawn Nelson, and I'm an author and professional storyteller. The theme for this episode is The Bells, in which we're exploring some of the folklore and stories associated with, specifically, church bells. For this episode's story trail, I was all set to record our village church bells. The bell ringers practice each Thursday without fail, and they really are a joy to listen to. However, this Thursday, it has been a fail. They were not practising, and it's a bit of a mystery why. And in fact, I have noticed that the church bells haven't been ringing the hour, so perhaps something's happened. I guess I will find out eventually through the village grapevine. But instead of our village church bells, you have my daughter and I singing a nursery rhyme sung in playgrounds for centuries. It has been catalogued in the Roud Folk Song Index as number 13190, and it's known more commonly as Oranges and Lemons. The song is part of a school game here in the UK, where two children stand opposite each other and make an arch with their arms as the others walk under the arch and round in a circle until the end of the song. The last verse is chanted, and whoever is under the arch at the time is trapped and replaces a friend in the arch for the next round. I won't spoil it for you if you haven't heard that last verse, but it is pretty violent and dark compared to the rest of the jolly and very pretty song. For obvious reasons, the children don't literally reenact it, but it is thought that this verse is representative of the tradition of bells ringing out across London town when there was an execution. As a result, this nursery rhyme has become the haunting soundtrack of several horror movies. In 1973, it featured in The Wicker Man, and in 2017, the horror film It, based on Stephen King's novel. The bells that I've added to the background of our song are courtesy of Pixabay Sound Effects. The St Clement's bells in London do actually play out this tune, and if you want to hear what that's like, I've put a link in the show notes for you. So here it is, sung with joy and no horror whatsoever, is Oranges and Lemons.
Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 5 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch. And when will that be, say the bells of Stepney. I do not know, say the great bells of Bow.
Here comes the candle to light you to bed, and here comes the chopper to chop off your head. Ah! The bells, is a quote that many attribute with Quasimodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. It's an extremely well-known quote, but it's one of those that's never actually happened, or at least not uttered by Quasimodo. Apparently, Quasimodo never once says this in the book or the film. How do I know this? Because I haven't read The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I know of it, but I haven't read it. Well, I stumbled upon a thread on Literature Stack where some fine persons had looked into this. To give them full credit, Lewis010 found that the quote was likely to have come from a play translated by Leopold David Lewis from a Polish play by Erckmann Chatrain. This was written in the late 1800s. This play was called The Bells. In the play, a man is haunted by his conscience because he has killed a merchant. This merchant has a sleigh with bells on it, and so the murderer, Matthias is his name, thinks he can hear these bells haunting him, hence the bells, which he does utter in that play. But it is not sleigh bells that I would like to look at in this episode, although as a general item of interest, attaching bells to things is thought to fend off negative energy and evil spirits. Instead, I'd like to talk to you about the bells that you are unlikely to attach to your keys or bags. The bells I'd like to talk about are those found in churches and cathedrals, although these too, as we will discover, ward off evil spirits. Most obviously, bells have been used for centuries as a way to call people to gather for prayer, services or other events within the community. It was most probably the monks' tradition of ringing the bells at various points in the day to indicate times for devotion and prayer that eventually spread to the wider community as a way of telling the time. Bells were first introduced to churches from around 400 AD. The patterns rung out by bell ringers are called methods. Each bell has a number, and then the ringers ring out in order at first, and then in different patterns, some more complicated than others, and all require skill and practice. In our village, as you've just heard, the bell ringers practice on a Thursday, possibly to make sure that people know when it is that they're practicing and don't complain about excess noise, although I'm not sure anybody would in our village. We all very much welcome the church bells, whether we're churchgoers or not. The methods that bell ringers play have some very interesting names. Plain Bob, Double Norwich, Kent Treble Bob Minor, Beverley Surprise Minor, and my personal favourite, Cambridge Surprise. What is the surprise? I would like to know. If anybody out there does have this knowledge, well, please do share it with me. As I mentioned in relation to smaller bells that can be attached to things, church bells were also originally used as a way to drive away evil demons and, of course, eventually the Christian construct, which is the devil. You will often find in story that the devil will dance through the night or get up to whatever mischief they're about to until the cockerel crows or a bell is rung. Both of these indicate the return of the light and the eradicating of the dark or evil, depending on how you look at it. The good folk, or fey folk, are also said to dislike the sound of church bells. However, in the story of the Green Children of Woolpit, a story of two children with green-tinged skins speaking in tongues with a penchant for broad beans appearing one day on the outskirts of a village called Woolpit, it is revealed by the girl that it is the sound of the church bells that draws them out of their subterranean home and into the world of Woolpit. So I'm not entirely sure that one stacks up. As always with the fey folk, it's difficult to tell what will upset them and what won't. I was recently doing some online storytelling with Jason Buck, storyteller, and Graham Cook from Tales of Britain and Ireland. And one of the audience members proffered the theory that the rules when it comes to the fey folk have actually been constructed by the Christian Church in order to try and create barriers between those old beliefs and the ones that they wanted people to believe, i.e. the ones about one omnipotent God and the Church. So anyway, perhaps that's one of those. As well as the devil and the fey folk, church bells were also thought to be able to fend off the plague and other illnesses should a village be afflicted. And on the subject of folk medicine, if a woman was in labour, her family could pay for the bells to be rung, and this was thought to expedite the proceedings. Perhaps it just drowned out her yells and made it go quicker for everybody else. Who knows? Church bells are, of course, rung to call people to prayer, services, marriages, funerals, christenings, and general community events. The bells will sometimes be rung in something called a death knell or memorial ring. This will involve ringing out the person who has died's age, and in some cases preceding that with 3 lots of 3 rings for a man and 2 lots of 3 rings for a woman. This quite frequently happens today in villages where a long-standing member of the community has passed, and in fact I've heard it done in my own village. For whom the bell tolls is a phrase that comes from John Donne's poem of the same name, in which he philosophises on the subject of death and how the bell, in fact, this memorial ring, will in fact toll for us all at some point. Church bells can also be used as a warning. During World War II, church bells were temporarily banned from ringing and were only to ring if there had been an invasion. You will find this at the end of the film Bedknob and Broomsticks. It's a perfect example of the bells being rung in this way. Church bells were also once rung during thunderstorms, as they were thought to protect the village against lightning strike. This belief is borne out in an inscription that is in one of the 3 bells at Hyington, County Durham, dating back to the 15th century. It could be argued that this is possibly left over from some kind of folk memory belief in Thor, although in this case, the inscription seems to call on St. Peter to quell the storm if the bell is rung. However, as we are all well aware in this day and age, it is often the highest point that will be struck by lightning, and if there is metal involved, then all the better. The church towers were often the tallest points, and the bells made excellent conductors, especially if they were open to the elements, and the bell ropes were wet through from the inevitable rain that accompanied the thunder. As a result, in France and Germany during the 18th and 19th century, there are records of over 200 deaths of bell ringers that were a result of bells being rung during a thunderstorm. Before being placed in the church tower, the new bell is baptised and given a name. In this way, it is thought that they can become inextricably linked to the place where they hang. and should they ever be removed, that they will somehow return. And there are several cases throughout stories and folklore of bells going missing. In Bowness, Cumberland, each time a new vicar was employed at St Michael's Church, a request was sent from Middleby in Dumfries for the return of their bell. It was said that the Dumfries bell had been stolen by the Bowness parishioners as payback for one stolen by Scottish raiders. And so when the request was sent from Middleby in Dumfries, the vicar of Bowness would reply with, "When we get ours." As well as going missing, bells seem to frequently end up underwater. Near Lyminster there is a knucker hole. If you're not sure what that is, it's a deep pool of water said to be inhabited by a dragon, in particular a water dragon known as a knucker or nikor in Old English. No one knows how deep it is, but a long time ago some of the men from the village wanted to find out, and so they took the large church bell and dropped it down into the water to see how long it would continue to ring for. Apparently it's still ringing to this day. When raiders attempted to steal the bell from Bosun Church in Sussex, it is chronicled that the bell eventually sunk the ship. As the raiders stole away the bell, the monks at Bosun rang its sister bells, and as they rang from the church tower, the bell that was on the raiders' ship gave one final toll as it catastrophically fell through the hull of the ship and into the harbour below, never to be retrieved. Another example is the Kensham bell. When the community ordered a new bell with the intent of having a much larger, grander bell than before, they ordered a bell that was so enormous it was going to be called Great Tom of Kensham. When the ship arrived with the Kensham bell and several other bells that had been ordered, all the other bells were disembarked safely apart from the Kensham bell. As that bell was being unloaded, the captain became agitated at the difficulty he was having getting it off the ship, and he cursed at the bell, at which point the rope snapped and the bell fell into the harbour. At the loss, the community went to the Cunning Man to find out how to retrieve the bell, and they were told that they would need the fairly classic 6 white cow remedy, all yoked up and pulling the bell out of the water. They would need to pull it to the top of the hill without any exclamations of joy or despair. So the villagers did this. They got their 6 white cows, they yoked them up, and they started to pull the bell out of the water. They'd almost got it to the top of the hill when the captain saw that the bell had been retrieved, and he was so overjoyed that his mistake had been remedied that he could not help crying out, which then of course sent the bell tumbling down the hill once more. I suspect that particular captain never worked out of that harbour again. There's a similar story hailing from Forrabury, Cornwall, although this one has a much more disastrous ending for the captain. The good burghers of Forrabury wanted to replace their church bell and commissioned one to be made in Spain. The bell arrived by sea, and as it neared the coast, the bells of Tintagel rang out to welcome it home. One of the crew members fell to his knees and thanked God for their safe passage, at which point the captain chided and mocked him, saying their safe passage was due to his own skill and not anything to do with God. The crew member warned him against his blasphemy and asked him to thank God, but the captain absolutely refused, and a storm whipped up. The community could only watch from the cliff edge above as the ship was consumed by the sea and the bells with it, ringing as they went to their watery graves. The subject of bells disappearing to watery beds and 6 oxen and various other rituals brings us to this episode's story. This is the story of the Mermaid of Marden. It's a very old folktale and can be found in various forms online, and I've also found it in River Folk Tales by Lisa Schneidau, so you can find different versions in different places. But this is my version of the Mermaid of Marden. A long time ago, in a village called Marden near Bristol, around 600 AD, there was a bell which was forged in honour of St Ethelbert, a mighty East Anglian Saxon king who was later beheaded by Offa, but we'll skip over that fact. The bell was a bit smaller than you might imagine, and instead of hanging in a tower, it hung from a wooden frame which stood outside the church at Marden. The bell would be rung at least once a day to call people to worship and prayer, and this is the story of how it ended up in the River Lugg to be precise, which once flowed a little closer to the church than it does now. There was once a mermaid who lived out on the edges of the Bristol Channel. She loved where she lived, out by the rolling sea, and close enough to the people that she didn't get lonely. However, the people were noisy, especially the ones by the harbours, all the toings and froings, and as time wore on, it never stopped. And so gradually she worked her way inland to find a quieter place to live. She worked her way up the Bristol Channel, through the Severn Estuary, up the River Wye, and eventually into the River Lugg. It was a long swim, but she oh so longed for peace, for everywhere she stopped it was still just as noisy, until she eventually found the village of Marden, some 50 miles plus up the river. It was a moonlit night, and she was tired, and the village was so quiet she curled up in the bottom of the river and slept better than she had ever slept before. Yes, this would be her new home. She did indeed sleep well that night, and she was awakened by the church bells, which was irritating, but she'd get used to that, she was sure. It was much better than the foghorns and trade ships and clattering of anchors in the harbour, that was for sure. Life was pretty uneventful for the mermaid. Nobody knew she was there, so she was quite happy being left alone at the bottom of the river, and she'd occasionally come out and sit on a stone on a moonlit night and comb her hair. Every Sunday the priest would, without fail, ring the bell that stood outside the church. Now the priest, he was a community-minded man, and a godly man, as you might expect, but he wasn't all that good at maintaining the church, and the rope on that bell had got more and more frayed, until one day, when he was fervently pulling on the rope of the bell to bring people to church, it snapped. He fell back with a thump on his backside, and the bell tumbled down the hill past him. Even if he'd been able to catch it, it would only have done him damage. It was quite a heavy bell. He would never have been able to stop it going where it was going, for gravity had taken over, and it rolled down the hill and into the water, rudely waking the mermaid up. She was not at all happy, and she dragged the bell down to the depths of the river and curled her tail around it. There was no way they were having that back. Now she would get her peace once and for all. The villagers all heard the banging and clanging of the bell, and they thought maybe the apprentice had got hold of the bell for some reason, and that was the noise that it was making today to bring them to church. And so they all gathered around the church to find that the wooden frame that the bell was on was empty. And when they heard the priest's story that the bell was now at the bottom of the river, well, they did not know what to do. They walked down to the river, and they stood at the side of it, and they scratched their heads. They looked down into the depths of it. They couldn't see the bell. They looked around the reeds. No, it wasn't tied up in the reeds. They looked a little bit further up. It hadn't been pushed anywhere by the water. It was a heavy bell. They couldn't think where it could possibly have gone. It must be down there somewhere. And so it was then that one of the farmers rolled up their breeches and got into the water, moving around very slowly so as not to kick up all the silt. He could see a little clearer in the bottom, and so it was that he saw the mermaid with her tail wrapped around the bell. "Here, the mermaid's got it," he said. "What do you mean?" said the villagers. "A mermaid? We haven't got a mermaid in a river. We have. She's down here." The mermaid was holding tight to that bell. He beckoned for a couple of them on the bank to get in the water and see if they could help him pull out the bell together. And they did. They too rolled up their breeches and they got in, and there was 3 or 4 of them all round the bell trying to wiggle it free of the mermaid and pull it out of the water. But the mermaid was not letting go of that bell. Somebody sent the priest to get a cross, and the priest brought the cross down and waved it around over the mermaid. But the mermaid just looked at them grumpily from the bottom of the river. She wasn't moving, and no cross was going to bother her. So they did what any self-respecting community does, and they went to their wise woman. And they asked her, "What are we going to do about the bell?" And so she said, "Well, have you tried asking the mermaid politely?" "Oh no, we ain't tried that," they said. "Well, go back and ask her." So they did, and they went back, and this time they all got in the water again. This time 5 of them, because they knew the bell was heavy, and they looked down at the mermaid, and they said, excuse me, Madam Mermaid," because you know you need to speak politely to mermaids. "Madam Mermaid, could we have our bell back, please?" This time she rose out of the water, her tail still curled around the bell, and she said, "No, absolutely not. You lot have made a clattering and a banging and a racket with this bell for years, and I have never been able to sleep in. So I am finally going to get my lie in, and you are not having this bell back." Well, the villagers were at a loss. They went back to the wise woman again. They said, "What are we going to do? She won't give us the bell back. She says we've been disturbing her peace for years, and so we can't have the bell back. Well, I know what there is to do, said the woman. I've heard it written down in law many times that what you need is 12 white oxen. Pure white, mind, not a dab of black or brown or beige or anything else on them. Pure white oxen. And then you want yokes that are made from the yew trees, the sacred yew trees. And you want to tie to their tails little branches of rowan to keep them protected. That's what you need. And it's going to take the whole community to do this, because there are 12 oxen that you need to pull that bell out, and you're going to need the whole community to help keep those oxen in check. And while they're doing it, they need to be completely silent. Right, we've got it, said the community. And so it was that the whole community gathered on the bank with the 12 white oxen. It had taken them quite a long time to acquire these oxen. I mean, everybody in the village who farmed their own land, they had an oxen, but not necessarily a white one. So they had had to travel quite far and wide to gather these oxen together. But finally, after a month or so of travelling, they had. And they brought them all back, and they'd carefully carved the yew yokes, and they placed them on the oxen, and they were about to now tie the ropes to the bell and take the bell out of the river. They sent one small child into the river to creep stealthily towards the bell and tie the big rope around it, which eventually would be pulled by the oxen. They knew that they must not wake the mermaid, for who knew what magic she may hold, and they did not want her interfering with the process. And they were all as silent as mice as they did it. They tied that rope around the bell. The child came back out of the water and he stood with the community, and they stood with their hands tightly together, almost in prayer, if you like, waiting to see what would happen. The oxen moved on. The oxen themselves didn't make any sound either. They must have sensed what was going on, for they made not an utterance, and they worked their way up the bank. They had almost got to the point where the bell was out of the water, when the priest, so delighted was he that they almost had the bell back, and perhaps having had maybe just a tiny little bit too much of the communion wine, he shouted out, "We have the bell, despite of you, you devil!" Of course, referring to the mermaid, who heard. Because even if you don't hear the nice things said about you, invariably we hear the bad things, do we not? And so she woke up. She saw what was happening, and that the bell was about to be put back on the stand and would once again be rung every week. And she took a sharp bit of flint from the bottom of the riverbed and cut that rope so that the bell fell back down to the bottom. She filled it full of rocks and stones and made it her home and curled herself around it every day and every night, and there was no way the villagers were ever going to get that bell back. It's said that that bell still lives at the bottom of the lug. However, in some versions of this story, she doesn't fill the bell with stones and she doesn't use it as her home. Instead, in the dead of night, on a new moon no doubt, she takes that bell up to the church pond, where the villagers will never suspect to find it, and she hides it well in the reeds. And the only reason we know she did this was because, well, eventually, in 1848, some villagers did find that bell in the bottom of the pond. And you can find that bell now in the Herefordshire Museum, the Mermaid's Bell of Marden. Thanks for joining me to ring the church bells for this episode of Stories from Law. For more folklore and stories, you can subscribe to my Substack newsletter. Just hop on over to the Substack site and search for Cerridwen's Cauldron, or use the link in the show notes. You can upgrade to paid on this platform for just £5 a month to access an archive of over 100 posts exclusively for paid subscribers. Signing up as a paid or free subscriber is very much appreciated and helps to support the podcast and my work with folklore and story. As well as Substack, you can find me on Instagram as Dee Dee_Storyteller and on Facebook as Dee Dee Storyteller. Reviews are always gratefully received and your support is greatly appreciated. I hope to see you there, as I'd love to tell you another story. Until next time, toodle pip.